But what about the Second World War with Russia? They win, right?
Yeah.
They take heavy losses, but they actually win.
Well, that is true, and they paid a massive price for it, but of course, in some sort of brutal Bolshevik calculation, it was something they could afford. Uh, but of course, it leaves a trauma to the Soviet memory and to the Russian memory. So uh, it was a very much devastated country. 20, it had lost maybe 27 million, 20 or 27 million people. I'm not certain. Maybe if I'm not completely mistaken, it was 7 million soldiers and 20 million civilians. But I think you'll have to check that
Yes,
one.
I'll add the facts. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think one of the it in a modern Russian mentality, it probably reinforced the vision that Russia is always threatened from the outside, and one reasons why Soviet Union created one such a big empire in Eastern Europe was so that it would have sort of a buffer zone to prevent all sort of future invasions from the West. So it wasn't purely to spread communism, but also this sort of security issue. But of course, this new Eastern Empire that they created, it caused a vast amount of resources, and ultimately Soviet Union didn't have the resources to keep the whole Soviet socialist system in a function. It didn't simply have resources enough to keep this massive empire standing.
Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, there's a lot of territory to cover here in
Mm.
the 19th century since, I mean, it's, first of all, we have more data,
Mm.
and second of all, it's, I think it's more happening.
Yeah,
Faster changes, new
yeah,
technologies, um, yeah, more bigger powers at play, I would say.
yeah,
And yeah, and technology is just making everything to the power of two.
yeah, yeah, and well, I think that Soviet Union, I don't think it had a proper chance to win the Cold War competition. It was uh, maybe maybe militarily in some sense it would have had if it had more. I don't actually think so. That maybe the arms race without a great sort of military conflict like a third world war which would have wiped everything out. Soviet Union couldn't have won the Cold War. It was simply the uh, socialist system didn't have the sort of resources to beat the United States in its game.
So do you think, because that's something that, I've heard as when I was growing up
Mm.
and just learning the fundamentals of history, is that United States challenged Soviet Union economically, and that somehow drove them into collapse. But I never fully understood it. For example, with what's this weapon project, like
Star Wars, I
Star
think.
Wars, yeah,
Yeah.
and that was so financially costful that Russia or Soviet Union couldn't keep up. So, would you say that the argument that they're making is that if US hadn't been pushing this Star Wars technology, like anti missile system, but then the USSR wouldn't have to either, and that would spare them the money for improving the country, or
Well, I think it is a simplification that, mm, and I'm not an expert in the region of Soviet economic history, but I think that arms race played a role in Soviet collapse. So if it wouldn't have been this tremendously expensive arms race with the United States, maybe Soviet economy would have been in better conditions. But I think
Would it have been in better conditions, or would they just have allocated that money that went to the weapons into building up society instead? Because
yeah,
you could make the case that it has the productivity that it has, no matter where you spend the money. Like you have X amount of income, and this is your, but where you spend it is another question.
yeah, well, yeah, arms race was one factor, but you made a very good point, and which I would have like to expand on it. That maybe the system was too. It had too many faults from the inside anyway to successfully function in the end. So even if there wouldn't have been any arms race, maybe it would have simply rotten from within from at some point. So it didn't have sort of it wasn't economically viable.
And
And
do we know this, or perhaps some people would beg to differ? But I'm just thinking, like, if you look at per citizen, the amount of productive output that they do, maybe it was substantially lower in a communistic system than a capitalistic.
yeah, well, I think it certainly one of the big issues was the lesser level of productivity. But a big factor in Soviet economic collapse, what I've read on is was the collapse of the oil prices. So it was a system greatly dependent on these natural resources, and when sort of price of oil dropped, Soviet system became had an immense amount of economic difficulties. So it was sort of it was dependent on these rare materials, these like exporting energy and like. And Soviet Union even had to import grain from the West at the end. So it wasn't sort of self-sufficient system, and that contributed to its downfall.
Yeah, I had no idea that the Soviet Union imported grains from the West in the end.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, that was the case, and it was different from the Stalin years, for example, when Soviet Union, well, it exported grain even though there was famine in Ukraine and Kazakhstan, for example. But well, of course, such imports helped prevent that in the later years of the Soviet Union there wasn't any sort of famine, even though the system of collective farming, it was always very inefficient.
I understand.
Mm.
One thing that we kind of forgot to mention, we said Russia won the Second World War, but we didn't exactly talk about the consequences of that. So one of the consequences was all the territory that they took, they kind of incorporated into the empire, or not empire, but the Union, Soviet Union. Is that right?
Well, they incorporated territories like the Baltic states, the some parts of Finland, some
Eastern
parts
Germany.
of Poland, from Kaliningrad, the earlier Königsberg. They were directly incorporated into the Soviet Union, and then there were the puppet states, the satellites, the East Germany, Romania, Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia, and others.
So they weren't actually part of the Soviet Union.
No, they were more like vassal states, sort of. In the they had to do much of what Soviets had to say, but they had a sort of independence. They had their own armies, police forces, and the like.
Mm.
But even though there were like Soviet military bases in these countries, but they, mm, of course, the independence was limited. And whenever some of these Eastern European states tried to have a more independent policy, mm, well, or let's say less communistic policy, like in Hungary in 1956 or in Czechoslovakia in 1968, Soviet Union sent troops and forced these countries to bow the Soviet line.
So it seems like that was just a facade, or that was just fake. That they weren't very independent after all. And you know, you've heard the stories about Stasi and like how they knew everything about everybody in Germany. So it just seems like that was a lie.
Well, yeah, it was one of the big lies of the communist system. It was, but I think Soviet leaders they really believed that they were uh, leading the march of humanity towards a greater progress and eventual socialist paradise. Even though, but it was sort of mixed. They somewhat believed in their ideology, but then in some sense they were also sort of imperialists who had a vast sort of empire which was controlled from Moscow, where the Russian was the primary language.
I hope you enjoyed that clip of the HH podcast. If you want to see another clip, click here down to your left. And if you want to see the whole unedited episode, click down here to your right. And last but not least, if you want to subscribe, you can do so here in the middle. Thank you.